Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Aude Montague. I'm the global facilitator at Finequity. Finequity is a community of practice that's hosted by CGAP, and that's dedicated to women's economic empowerment through financial inclusion. It's a pleasure to be moderating this 1-hour session today, which will be talking about financial abuse of women and girls in financial inclusion. The webinar is being recorded. And this webinar is really intended to be the start of a conversation. A few months ago, several Finequity members started discussing this topic and identified it as a topic they wanted to work together on. And so today we're really broadening to a larger community to start connecting with each other, sharing and learning from each other about this topic. The idea for today is really to introduce this sensitive and complex notion of financial abuse towards women and girls, and also how it relates to other notions such as economic violence, gender-based violence, or even things like consumer protection. The session will be discussing a working definition of financial abuse, and it will also be providing insights from work being done by others in this area. It's really meant as a conversation. We have practically no slides, just 2 slides at one moment but otherwise it's really going to be a chat between the presenters and the participants. So please chime in, ask your questions in the chat, introduce yourself, and please make this as interactive as we can. With us today, we have Bobby Gray, who's Senior Research Director at the Grameen Foundation. Recently, Grameen launched the program SAFE, which stands for Safeguarding a Woman from Abuse in the Financial Ecosystem. And Bobby just also wrote a blog, which was published earlier today on the Finequity website about financial abuse of women. I encourage you to read it, and we'll be posting it in the chat. Also with us, we have Dr. Nicola Scharf-Jeps. Nicola was the founder and former CEO of Surviving Economic Abuse UK. She's the next expert in this notion of economic abuse, and she's worked on the prevention of violence against women and girls since 2006, both in policy and in research roles. Thanks, Nicola, for being with us. And last, we have Sarah Twigg, who's the East Asia and Pacific Regional Lead for Gender and Economic Inclusion at the IFC. Sarah is currently based in IFC's office in Hanoi, so thanks for joining us so late in the evening, Sarah. Sarah spearheads collaborative projects with private sector partners with a specific emphasis on promoting women's access to financial services and supporting women-owned businesses and growth. Finally, with us, we have Swati, who's Finequity's incoming thematic lead on financial abuse. She's going to be actively moderating the chat today, she's a development researcher with over 15 years of experience working on the inclusive finance space, in particular on gender. She's currently based in Indonesia. So please, use the chat actively, and Swati will be providing responses and feeding some of the questions over to me. So please feel free to ask your questions all through the session today. So just to get us started, violence against women and girls is a major public health problem, and it's a violation of human rights. It can take very different forms, and financial violence or financial abuse is one of them. According to the WHO, these are really terrible statistics to be reminded of, but 1 in 3 women, 30% of women worldwide, have been subject to violence in their lives. Financial abuse is a hidden form of violence. It's often not seen and difficult to identify. But beyond the numbers, you start realizing how pervasive it is when you start chatting with people. At least for myself, over the past few months, I've had so many conversations in which I've heard women in particular talk about some more mild forms of violence, or like things like not having privacy on their bank account, expenses being monitored by an abusive partner, having money withdrawn from a joint account without giving full consent, sometimes a credit taken out in your name without you knowing exactly what was going on. And this happens for women who are in a relationship, and even after a separation. And despite being something so common, talking about economic violence or financial abuse is a very sensitive topic in the financial inclusion sector. The word violence may be too strong and causes a reaction when you raise it, and it might just raise the idea of someone being physically harassed or sexually abused, and it doesn't really reflect this idea of economic or financial abuse, or someone being harmed by someone economically. So with that, I want to turn to you, Bobby, to get us started about this idea of financial abuse. How do you introduce the topic of financial abuse in a way that keeps the door open, keeps the conversation productive without making people feel really uneasy or unimplicated?
No, thank you, Aud. It's great to be here. As I've shared, when I've started talking about this topic, looking at financial abuse has been a little bit of a passion project of mine for the past year. And I think this question of what words do we use to describe it has been, one of the first conversations that we've had, and really was the focus of the meeting that we had with a few people back in January, just to ask the question, should we talk about economic violence? Should we talk about economic abuse? Should we call it financial abuse? And that's really the point of the blog that I wrote, was just to reflect that the use of the words that we use is just a really important starting point for talking about it with, financial service providers themselves, as well as trying to understand, how do we understand this concept, and even interview people about it so that we can see what the experiences are of financial abuse in certain contexts. I would just, as by way of introduction, share that, some of my interest and Grameen's interest in this topic, really began about 6 years ago when we were working at this intersection of women's economic empowerment and gender-based violence. And like many, I think, organizations, you go into this with the picture of sexual and physical violence because it's the most obvious forms that you see, that you hear about, et cetera. But we kept seeing the definition of economic violence, with it, encompassed within the forms of gender-based violence, but really didn't understand how it related to the work that we were doing, because the projects were probably much more focused on this sexual and physical abuse. And as we kind of started going down the rabbit hole, once the projects, were done, I would say we focused a lot on thinking about how financial service providers can inform their clients about, resources in the community if they are facing gender-based violence, sensitizing staff around gender-based violence. And those were, I would say, kind of encompassed a lot of the efforts that we were doing. But we really understood during that time that we needed to do more around the financial service provision itself, thinking about at what point do, the way women come in contact with products and services, starting from the point of how they're marketed all the way through how they engage with those products and services. And we really wanted to be able to focus on that, but it really wasn't part of the scope that we were doing. But I think to be honest, one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have Nicola here is that, Surviving Economic Abuse, the NGO that she's been running, was really such a significant resource for me to understand, like, what is economic abuse, what is financial abuse? And I think that's where those aha moments came. And we were like, oh, for those of us that have been working in client protection, social performance management, there was this aha moment of, we really need to be working on this. Like, we need to kind of start expanding our definition of what we're trying to protect women from, that kind of goes beyond just what, the financial service providers are doing, but really think about what is their responsibility, what is not their responsibility, but what can they do? And so I think as we launched Program Safe, which you introduced earlier, we were really thinking the whole sector needs to be working on this. How can we come together? How can we understand this, understand financial abuse? What does it look like in different contexts? how can we raise awareness and sensitize staff about it? I mean, I think, you know, an important point for me as well is that if you look at that statistic of 30%, that also means some of your staff are potentially experiencing that as well. So it's not just focusing on the clients themselves, but making, you know, ensuring that the staff that you have understand what it looks like as well, and maybe what resources can an employer provide to their staff around economic violence. Since you know, we've already kind of talked about the use of the language. I mean, to me, it's been really important because even as we've interviewed people, you know, we were encouraged not to use the word violence when we were talking to them, you know, even going so far as just using words like mistreatment. And to me, I feel like there's still so much more to learn around how do you talk to people about it, so that, you know, you really can open the door to understanding, you know, a much deeper understanding. So I'm going to stop there because I'm really excited to hear what Nicola, you know, has to share. She really brings so much experience to the table, and she can kind of, you know, provide people more of a background of, you know, what is economic violence or economic abuse. So I'll turn it over to Nicola.
Thanks, Nicola. Over to you. I mean, you had a great introduction from Bobby, but we've heard from her how the work you've been leading in the UK has been really foundational in kind of defining what financial abuse looks like and getting to a working definition. So I know you have a few slides, so I'm just asking Danny if you can please put Nicola's slides up, and then over to you, Nicola. You have the floor.
Thanks, Ord, and thanks, Bobby, for such a kind intro. I am using slides because it's quite difficult to describe this power and control wheel otherwise. But my passion for responding to economic abuse and supporting victims and survivors to reach economic safety actually started in 2006 when I worked for a domestic abuse charity here in the UK. And I spoke to many victim survivors of domestic abuse in refuges, as we call them, or safe houses or shelters, and was really struck by experiences of economic abuse. And when I looked to the research and to policy and practice, there was no mention of economic abuse at all. So between 2006 and 2008, I undertook a piece of research which interviewed women in those services to understand what economic abuse looked like for them. And it's a bit of a mystery, really, because the original power and Duluth wheel, which we use, which draws on US practice, was actually developed by victims and survivors themselves. And you can see on the left-hand side towards the top there, using economic abuse actually was something that they themselves identified back in the early 80s. But for some reason, it had fallen out of practice. And I think what really struck me when I was exploring victim survivors of economic abuse, their experiences, was that not only is it a distinct form of coercive or controlling behaviour, a form of control, and that might be another term that we can use when we talk about economic abuse or economic violence. We might talk about economic control, or we might talk about economic coercion, for example. But as I said, what really struck me was that this form of abuse threaded through or reinforced the other forms of control that abusers used. So things like physical, sexual and emotional abuse. You could think about situations where money might be forcibly taken from a victim or survivor. So there being, you know, a physical injury if the victim survivor resisted, or sexual violence, where we see commonly in the UK, economic abuse includes restricting people from accessing economic resources, and that might mean that they can't open a cupboard and take food out without permission. And so you see an overlap with sexual violence when a victim survivor is forced perhaps to perform a sexual favour in order to access the food and the other basic necessities that they might need or their children might need. So for me, it's really helpful to understand economic abuse, not in isolation, but in recognition that it's most likely, as I said, threading through and reinforcing other forms of control. And certainly, you know, again, we know in the UK context that just physical violence, you know, the repercussion for challenging lesser forms, sometimes as people see as control, you know, that kind of response when you challenge other forms of control, you know, then shapes behaviour moving forward, because victim survivors recognise what the repercussion would be, you know, what the danger would be for resisting other forms of control that aren't physical or sexual in nature.
Thanks, Nicola. And, because we've heard from Bobby and some of the things you've suggested, the UK is quite advanced on this topic as compared to other countries in the world. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the steps that financial service providers have taken in the UK to tackle this issue of financial abuse?
Absolutely. If we just move to the next slide, it will provide a little bit of context for you. But when I founded the charity back in 2017, and it was just myself working part-time at that time, the then Prime Minister, who was Theresa May, introduced new landmark legislation around domestic abuse. And I met with officials very early on to influence them to include economic abuse within the statutory definition of domestic abuse. And really importantly, define what we meant by economic abuse within that legislation, because we had no definition. And this definition that you can see here actually draws on the work of Professor Adrian Adams, who's a professor in Michigan State University, and is my kind of guru in relation to economic abuse. I still get very excited every time we meet because she really started this work. And you can see here that we talk about economic abuse in the UK, and we do that deliberately. We're talking about financial abuse in this context, and certainly when we work with banks, we will also talk about financial abuse. But because we want to recognise the broad range of tactics that abusers use, we understand financial abuse to be the control of money, but we understand economic abuse to be the control of money and the things that money can buy. So therefore, it does include the examples that I've given, for example, like food. So it can be goods, services, or other property. And the UK legislative definition really makes that clear. So as I said, that's just really important in terms of holding abusers accountable for all their different types of behaviour. And the statutory guidance, which underpins the Domestic Abuse Act, which finally became legislation in 2021, actually recognises for the first time the role of financial institutions to play in responding to domestic, including economic abuse. So again, very early on when I founded the charity, I worked closely with the largest banking group in the UK. 1 in 4 people in the UK bank with Lloyds Banking Group. They have one product with them. They have many brands. And we really didn't know what we were doing. And in some ways, it's a kind of a full circle in terms of, bringing together expertise across different areas, saying, I know about this, you know about that, let's come together, let's have these conversations, let's work together to look at what a response might look like, whether that be in a particular industry or in a particular country or a particular context. And so working with Lloyds Banking Group and the membership organisation for banks in the UK, which is called UK Finance, the industry developed a code of practice which creates a number of principles that financial institutions should implement when responding to customers. And Bobby made a really good point that this work shouldn't really take place externally facing until you've addressed the issue internally, in terms of the organisation that you're working with, because it is not really fair to expect people working within an organisation to support others if they're going through those same experiences. And that is the kind of thing that's covered within the code, making sure there's training for colleagues, then knowing how to respond to customers, and a number of things that can be done for customers are outlined in that code, which just creates consistency because we do have a lot of banks in the UK. We have a lot of challenger banks and tech banks, which are also particularly interesting when it comes to the tactics of economic abuse. So the industry came together in 2018, first of all, to develop those standards, and then they were refreshed in 2021 to reflect an understanding of the Domestic Abuse Act. And I would just add that those behaviours that we talk about do include restriction, they include exploitation, and they include sabotage. And the work that I've done around the world, and certainly the economic power and control wheel, I know is used in practitioners in countries across the globe. Those manifestations of economic abuse might look different in those different contexts, but those examples generally will fall under those 3 different forms of control. So I think it's really important. And again, certainly in the UK, like most gender-based violence, this is both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality, where women certainly in the UK, couldn't take out credit in their own name, or have a mortgage, as we call them, or a house loan without a male guarantor. As recently as around 50 years ago, you can see how abusers take advantage of those structural inequalities that exist. And when those structural inequalities start to get addressed, so for example, women can now take out a mortgage in their own name or credit in their own name, they find different ways of either creating that economic dependency that used to exist, or sabotaging what that victim survivor has achieved in a way that creates instability. And it just leaves a victim survivor in a situation where they can't use the economic resources in the way that they want to. It's being controlled by somebody else. That makes it difficult to leave. It makes it difficult to be able to rebuild your life independently. And it's a major reason why a lot of victims and survivors in the UK will go back to an abuser. And certainly things like COVID, and we have a cost of living crisis happening in the UK, again, are what we call conducive contexts, which often enable and facilitate this abuse.
Thanks. This is so rich, Nicola, already, and I'm jotting down a lot of questions. But we'll come back to you. I want us to move to Sarah. You said you had this opportunity in the UK to come together and learn from each other, and this is really our opportunity right now to come to you, Sarah, and learn from you, because IFC in East Asia and the Pacific has been doing quite a lot, and I'd love to ask you a bit more first to reflect on this, what we've heard so far about the definition of financial abuse and how you're using this concept in East Asia and the Pacific. And then what are the different aspects that IFC considers as part of this financial abuse definition? We saw on Nicola's slides restriction, exploitation, sabotage, but how do you define economic financial abuse at the IFC in East Asia and the Pacific?
Thanks so much, Aud. And I want to be very upfront. We are at the very beginning of this journey. So we are very much standing on the shoulders of Nicola and Bobby and others who are further along this journey. And really the reason why IFC is starting to take a very strong focus on this issue is, as the largest global development institution focused exclusively on the private sector, we have over $7 billion invested in the financial services sector in Asia Pacific alone. So as an institution, we have a huge exposure to the financial services industry, which brings with it obviously potential risks, but also brings with it a significant amount of influence and convening power. And so we really saw this as an opportunity to build on the work that we had been doing around the intersection of gender-based violence and the workplace, to really look at this more from the lens of our kind of financial sector portfolio. And so very much the approach that IFC is taking is we are focusing on this in terms of what financial institutions can be doing to prevent and respond to financial abuse that may happen within their systems. So we're taking very much a focus on the institution themselves and the role that they play as as the designers and the owners of these products and services, which are very often what are being misused by perpetrators. And so what we're doing, and as I said, we're sort of at the beginning of this journey, but we're bringing together initially 10 banks across 5 countries in Asia and the Pacific, to do a multi-company partnership where we're really going to try to build out some evidence about how these issues are playing out in the context of commercial banks in emerging markets. Because one of the things that has become very clear to us as we've started to work on this topic, there is very little data and evidence around the prevalence, around what responses are effective, or really, I think to the point that some of the comments have been made around why financial institutions should be focusing on this issue. And so really we're coming at this from the perspective of, as a financial institution, you are the ones who are designing these products. You are the ones who are responsible for putting these products out in a way that is safe and that is designed in a way that is not doing any potential harm to your consumers. And so as a result, there's a responsibility. So for us, it also sits within our responsible finance business, because we see this as an element of responsible finance. And so what we will do with these 10 with these 10 banks is working with Nicola and other experts like herself, is to actually develop a diagnostic tool that banks can use in their organizations to start to understand how this issue is impacting their employees, how it's impacting their customers, what are some of the ways that they're seeing their products and services being misused, and really through doing that, to actually then be able to develop an action plan of what are some of the specific interventions that they can put in place to start to address those, whether it's things like changing terms and conditions, addressing the way that they're designing mortgage products or credit cards, or, so really looking at the things that they have control of. And we're very lucky that we have some strong kind of technical experts who'll be supporting us in this process, as well as the experience of one of the largest banks in Australia, Commonwealth Bank Australia, who've done a lot of work in this space, and they're really a leader in terms of integrating meaningful changes and actions into their processes and into their systems. And so we'll be able to learn from their experiences and take very much what they've been doing, through into the work we're doing with our banks. And maybe I just wanted to pick up on 2 points, because I think one of the comments that both Bobby and Nicola made was this idea that financial institutions also need to have their own house in order first. And so I think, this is very much one of the principles that we will also be applying, that if a financial institution is going to start looking at how it can address financial abuse, it needs to do so in a way that also ensures it has the existing practices and policies in place to support staff who may be experiencing different forms of gender-based violence, including financial abuse. And so certainly with all of the banks that we're working with, that will be one of the starting points, is to make sure that they have that in place as well, because of course that helps to ensure that the interventions don't do harm, and that people have access to the services if they need them.
Thanks. I think this is a really good segue into one of the questions we have in this chat from Sonia Kelly, who's asking, how do you get FSPs to care about, financial service providers to care about this issue of economic violence and financial abuse? She mentioned she's had conversations with FSPs who explicitly don't want to focus on this topic because they're afraid of what they'll find. So what are your suggestions there? And then Bobby and Nicola, if you want to jump in also.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure that Nicola will have a lot of insights on this, but we're in this exact situation right now where we're having these business development conversations with banks to say, hey, this is a really important issue that you need to be thinking about. And I think what has been a really gratifying experience is that when you start to show them some of the ways that these behaviors are playing out within their own products and services, immediately they get it. And in many cases, they have seen it already. And so, for example, we've had some banks in Papua New Guinea who actually came to us and they said, look, we see that there are these significant issues around financial abuse on our banking systems. Can you help us? So I would not assume that the banks don't already know that this is happening. And so really it's about helping them to understand some of the ways in which this happens, and helping them to realize that actually it's not anything that they've done or not done. It's that these things haven't been taken into consideration when designing products or services. I think the other thing which we've found to be very compelling is, even though there's not a lot of evidence around the prevalence, because this isn't something which people have been able to track very systematically, I think when you say, and the statistics that do exist are very compelling, that 90% of people in the US who report to the police of domestic violence also experience financial abuse. And so the numbers are just so significant that clearly a very large proportion of any bank's portfolio is going to be experiencing some forms of these abuse. And so, in that sense, I think it gets easier for them to get their head around it, because they realize actually it's very endemic, and they are in a position to do things that can be relatively simple, as I think Nicola will talk about, that can make a really meaningful difference.
Thanks, Nicola, over to you. And with a twist, I'd like to ask you specifically with the rise of digital banking and digital and new technologies, does that offer any specific risks and opportunities in this prevention of financial abuse?
I mean, I think it offers both, and we like to focus on technology as a force for good. But as Sarah said, perpetrators will use any means to control a partner, and quite often they will use products or processes or policies where clearly that wasn't what was in mind when they were developed. And part of our work when we work with banks is to look at those again and to close down opportunities to control. So just to give a really simple example, a lot of victim survivors in the UK will have had a joint bank account with the perpetrator. So just thinking about those controlling tactics that I talked about, if they access their banking online, the perpetrator might change the password so the victim survivor can't access, doesn't have any access to that joint bank account, doesn't know how much money is in it. At the same time, they might exploit that victim survivor by taking out an overdraft, which is quite common, although I know it doesn't exist in all countries, but basically very low rate credit facility, and take that to the absolute max because that's a joint bank account. Both parties are jointly and severably liable, so the victim survivor might not have a clue how much debt that they're in, which they are jointly responsible for. And that has a negative impact on their credit rating. So that would be an example of sabotage. So you can kind of start to see how this plays out within different products. So to circle back round to your original question to Sarah Ord, because also it just really struck me, it was one of the first questions Bobby asked me when we first connected, is, what is that motivation for financial services to get involved in this? And actually, the more I thought about it, the longer my list becomes. And I think, what's really struck me is just been the kind of passion and motivation of particular individuals. We have found individuals within certain financial institutions have really championed this, both in their own organisations, but also within the industry as well. And I think we're at a point where, we're starting to institutionalise a response to economic abuse, but, I still think a lot of individuals are driving it. And one really effective way of getting individuals involved or engaged in this issue is just to talk about it internally. Again, we've talked about the experience of staff themselves. It's very likely that someone working within the bank or financial institution will have experienced economic abuse. And we found it's been very powerful when they've spoken out publicly about that, especially if they're in senior positions, because there's so much shame and stigma, of course, still sadly attached to gender-based violence, that people think, if I disclose this, I might lose my job. People might think I'm not capable. They might think I'm stupid. So actually to show that really high-level leadership can have a huge impact. But I've talked about how we've developed economic abuse and an understanding in the UK. A lot of that has been linked to national legislation. A lot of it's linked to regulation. So certainly those who experience economic abuse in the UK are recognised as what we call vulnerable customers. And banks, again, have certain principles and standards that they have to meet. And we've recently had a new piece of legislation called the Consumer Duty, which actually pretty much addresses this issue around the design of products and services. So it introduces a new duty on financial services to prevent foreseeable harm, which again is really, really powerful because it means they have to look at the products in the market and close down those opportunities for control. And they have to think about economic abuse and other vulnerability issues when they're designing products. So that sits alongside things like mental health challenges, bereavement, terminal illness, gambling. Our vulnerable customer agenda is really quite wide. So it's really significant that economic abuse is now recognised within that, because we've seen real flexibility and support for customers, which, if I'm honest, I would never have dreamed was possible when I started this work back in 2006. I mean, it's just incredible how far firms have come in the UK. And certainly I was very much inspired by practice in Australia as well. So I just think it shows how far, we can go and what can be done.
Thanks, Nicola. And because you mentioned how this overlaps with consumer protection and protecting the vulnerable consumer, I know we have Juan Carlos from CGAP online, and I wanted to ask you, Juan Carlos, if you can speak up and tell us about, how you see the overlap between consumer protection issues and this question of financial abuse of women and girls.
Thank you very much, Ode, and I think this is a very important conversation that is happening now. through this panel, and it's important to raise it. It's important to really put it more in the limelight of our discussions on consumer protection. I believe that there are already some important concepts that are emerging as important in the consumer protection arena that really can make this topic, this issue of financial abuse, be part of the conversation. One of the important topics that we are already raising in the international community, we're talking about, is the topic of customer outcomes, such as what the UK has done for quite a bit on the TCF, treating customers fairly. But there is an important shift in a way in the discussion around consumer protection to move from compliance-based type of approaches that focus on just what financial institutions would do to meet a regulation, but going a step further, which means, okay, what those actions lead to for consumers. So taking an angle on the customer, on the person themselves. So this is especially good for the financial service institutions to think that actually when they're doing their work, they need to not only think about how they comply with the rules and laws, but also how those actions actually influence and have a consequence on the customers that they are serving. But also important for the financial sector authorities, who then look at what the financial institutions' actions are affecting, how they are affecting and affecting the customers. So that's a very important shift that we are looking at, having customers at the center. Together with this, we're also seeing the concept of customer vulnerability that is quite important to add to the conversation in terms of making sure that authorities really have a way to define vulnerability, but also to start monitor issues around customer vulnerability and some indicators, and getting some important data. On those two fronts, a very important third element of the discussion is the point around gender and gender disaggregated data, and how financial authorities can work with financial institutions to better collect gender disaggregated data from the supply side on top of what could be collected from the demand side. And this is also important because monitoring risks and outcomes through this data can help identify more explicitly, kind of have more evidence on what is happening with some of these social norms that we are seeing that can have a significant impact on kind of perpetuating those norms that are kind of moving the balance against women. And that sometimes one of the challenges is that authorities and financial services institutions don't realize that gender neutrality is in many cases gender blindness that lead to perpetuation of gender biases. So taking out the presumption that they need to be neutral, which is a topic that in many cases financial authorities have a concern that no, we have to be neutral in our regulation, in our policies, in our supervisory actions. We cannot move the needle, but we are part of our work in CGAP is also letting them know, no. If you have so many regulations or policies or even laws in your country that don't allow for women to fully have their rights in place and to have autonomy in their financial actions, then you are not being gender neutral. You are continuing to perpetuate gender biases against women. So I think this is another very important topic that it's becoming part of the conversation, and I think it's helping authorities kind of think beyond the traditional way of consumer protection and thinking about how can we do more actions to address these inequalities on women. And one extra point I would like to also mention, this is starting to be part of the conversation, although a bit less strongly, is the part of gender minorities and the issue also of economic and financial abuse for the the LGBT plus women, and that includes, of course, the transgender community, where there is quite a lot of economic and financial abuse happening, not only with spouses, also some cases not just being taken out of their family roots, having to flee some internal family and societal environments that become dangerous for these minorities, and they end up having not ways to live, even to have access to an account for many reasons. And we saw those kind of really invisibility and higher levels of risk during the pandemic. So just wanted to also make that point.
Thanks, Juan Carlos, and for reminding us about these interconnected vulnerabilities. Bobby, I'd like to ask you to reflect on this question of how financial abuse relates to consumer protection, the client protection principles, and protecting vulnerable customers. And we have comments from participants, including David Myrie, for example, from Mayoral Village, who are asking about how the lack of digital capability or financial capability or literacy influences financial abuse or makes financial abuse even more pervasive. So Bobby, over to you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of different questions in there. Maybe I'll start out by reflecting that in most of the literature and even our own experience, when we've been talking about economic violence, people themselves experiencing it don't realize they're experiencing economic violence because it's so normalized within, cultures, communities, couples, families, etc., that they don't even realize until maybe the mirror is kind of put in front of them with the definition, and then all of a sudden they identify with the explanation. I mean, I just recently, yesterday, had a conversation with BNP in France, and they have these fantastic videos that they have put out that kind of demonstrate what different forms of economic violence looks like. And when you watch them, you're like, there's a lot of people that are going to identify with these videos, because it's something, it's everything from, demonstrating somebody that's expecting child support and not being given money, even though they know the person has it, or somebody draining an account without that person realizing that whatever money they've set aside for their children's education has been drained by somebody else in the household. And if I have time, I'll add them here, but eventually I can share them, because I think even for me, they've been really impactful to just see what, so that people can visualize what it looks like if you don't understand the definition itself. So I think even, just raising awareness among everyone, what it looks like, is an important starting point. And I think, the question about, well, how do you get FSPs to act? I mean, I think once the clear risks are put in front of them and the definitions, like they themselves start coming up with, oh, we've also seen this. Like one financial service provider shared that, one risk they're worried about is just the financial abuse of young people, that parents themselves are using their children's access to credit, as they get older. And by the time they start wanting to use credit themselves, they realize their parents have used all of their information to create accounts for their own access to credit in different contexts. So it's not like these intersectionalities of, we're talking about women here, but, I think in the United States, there's more, you see more actions around elder abuse, but less around these kind of intimate partner or family dynamics that, go all the way down to youth. So to the point about client protection, I mean, this has definitely been a conversation that I've had with, Beth Ryan and others from the Center for Financial Inclusion, is to ask the question, like, how can we integrate this into the client protection principles? Like, where's the line between what they're responsible and accountable for versus what is just good to do? And to be honest, I don't know what that is yet, but it's definitely something that we've talked about as maybe an important, one starting point, especially those that have been working with these principles, like to discuss, like, how do we expand a definition? How do we add a standard of practice, within that, so that you kind of understand where the line is drawn as to what they're accountable for versus, not. I mean, they can't do everything around gender-based violence, but there are probably definitely some things that they should be doing. So I'll just say it's a big question mark, and something that I think as a sector we need to be able to do, and maybe there's interest, among the group here to be able to help define, where, how to do that. So anyway, that's maybe my answer. Sorry, it's not a very satisfactory one, but maybe even Nicola or others have some sort of insights as to where those lines, are drawn, and like what they really are accountable for versus what's just the right thing to do. You know, once you start going down this pathway, how far can you go to be supportive of people, you know, facing financial abuse?
Nicola, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, Bobby shared the protections that you've been talking about with me, and reading through them, it's relatively easy to make links across to economic abuse. So again, debt would be a really good example of that. So to give you some stats in the UK context, we've got 1 in 5 adults experiencing economic abuse. Of those who experience domestic abuse, 95% experience economic abuse. So again, very close to research in other parts of the country. And 60% of those who experience economic abuse will be coerced into debt. We know on average they have 5 to 7 different creditors. The average debt pre-COVID in the cost of living for a victim survivor was less than £4,000. It's now £27,000. So you can start to see how these situations become a lot more complicated. And I think, again, it's about kind of recognising the impact that has on victims and survivors. So it's about that kind of safety moving forward, I would say. And another reason that you might want to look at this as a financial institution, you know, is from a human rights, you know, perspective. A lot of the firms that we talk to draw the links with their, you know, their ESG, their environmental, social, and sort of governance responsibilities, actually, because, you know, that kind of vulnerability can then be taken advantage of by other people. You know, certainly in the UK, it might mean that you go to an illegal lender. If you don't pay that lender, they might physically attack you. They might, again, insist on sex in order to repay the debt. So it creates additional risks. It forces some victims and survivors into relationships to live together, to join their finances in a way that they wouldn't have done otherwise, but they need to in order to survive, to look after themselves and their children when the cost of living is so high. So, you know, I think, you know, it's a little bit like how long is a piece of string, really. As I say, for us, that economic safety is maximising access to victim survivors' ability to use and control their economic resources, but it's also closing down those opportunities for control at every stage. And you can do that in so many different ways.
Thanks. There are many questions in the chat, and a lot are around good practices or early practices from financial service providers. One of them is about at what point should you be raising awareness about this issue and with whom? The question is from Nelly Mwangi in Kenya, asking, is it an issue you should be raising with staff for them to talk with customers about, or should you be doing awareness directly with customers? Like who do you go to, and at what point do you start talking about this issue? Maybe to you, Sarah, if you feel you want to respond.
No, I'm happy to kick things off and then I'll pass it to Nicola, because this is exactly one of the, I mean, this is one of the things that we'll be discussing with the banks that we're about to start working with. And I mean, our starting point is very much that the organization needs to have some systems in place before it goes and starts raising these issues with its own staff or certainly with its customers. Because what an institution does not want to do is to create a situation where they're raising expectations or they're raising awareness among their customers without any way of responding to that, because what that ultimately may lead to is further harm. And so really what we will be doing with the institutions we work with is getting them to do this diagnostic initially, so they understand how the issue is affecting, you know, their customers, their staff, and then to start to put in place some systematic responses and approaches, so that then when they go and start initially training their staff, they already can say, and by the way, here are some of the resources that you can direct, you know, yourself or your colleagues to if you need support. Here are some of the resources that you can immediately start directing our customers to, and here are some of the other steps that we'll be taking to address this issue. So I would say it's very much about an internal focus first, before going externally. Related to this is one of the things that we will also be ensuring that for each one of the institutions we work with, that they also build strong relationships with GBV service providers in the communities in which they operate, because inevitably some of the issues that are raised will be issues that they are not equipped to deal with, and they will never be equipped to deal with. Their banks, their financial service providers. And so it's imperative that they have those relationships with third-party service providers so that they can actually refer customers, but also their own staff, staff to those other service providers, whether it's counselling, safe houses, legal services, you know, the other kinds of gender-based violence service providers that exist in the community. And that's also a really important part of ensuring that the processes that they're putting in place are minimizing potential for further harm.
Great. Bobby, do you want to also react to this?
Yeah, to me, I mean, it's a great question. And one of the blogs that I recently shared was this very experience of, you know, it wasn't a financial service provider, but definitely someone working in, you know, women's economic empowerment, and the experience, training the management around gender and power dynamics. I mean, I think if you don't address people's own biases within the organization themselves, they're going to be terrible advocates when they get to the field because they don't believe what they're selling. Mm-hmm. And we had this very experience. And so I think for me, one of the important starting points is that if there's not already kind of a gender, I'm going to talk about like gender sensitization at a very deep level. Like, it's not just understanding definitions, what is being gender sensitive, what's being gender transformative, but really changing people's own attitudes. If you don't start that process internally, to me, you're potentially creating greater risk for people once they get to the field and they're trying to sell something that they don't actually believe in. And we had this experience in Ghana, and we were training mobile money agents and their spouses to share information at the community level around gender-based violence, and then found that the staff themselves were justifying certain forms of gender-based violence within the training itself. And you saw that they weren't completely convinced at why they were being asked to do what they were being asked to do. So I would make this point pretty critical up front, that I think if the people themselves within the financial institution do not fully understand and believe like the need to work on gender-based violence and why, I think you're creating a huge risk. So I would just say that is a really important learning that we've had. Even though we started from that, like the lesson is that we had to go all the way down to the frontline staff, from the CEO all the way down on the gender and, you know, power dynamics, to really start changing people's minds and attitudes if they weren't already there. And I think at that point, you know, once that starting point is created, then I think they themselves start to see the risks more clearly, because then they can internalize a little bit more what this looks like, when it happens.
An important way to change people's minds on these issues is getting some of the facts together and having more data on the issue, as Juan Carlos reminded us. We have a question from Jenny Holden in the chat, and I'll let this be our last question and ask all of you to share your reflections if you want. But how can we capture data on this issue in a way that's ethical and safe for people to report on? We know that it's a pervasive problem, but how can financial service providers capture the data and share it? Maybe to you first, Nicola, then Sarah, and then Bobby.
Yeah, again, it's a really good question. And I was speaking to an insurer, funnily enough, this morning, who's kind of starting, their own journey in the same way that the banking industry has in the UK. And they talked about how they've had an increase in number of disclosures recently, but it's still only, in the hundreds. They're a very large insurance provider. We've heard the stats. We know it should be a lot higher. So it is very much about how do you create those spaces where victims and survivors feel safe to disclose. And there's lots of different ways in terms of doing that. And again, that will depend on context and risks involved, but also creating confidence to have conversations. Again, my listening in banks sort of 5 or 6 years ago is, people were desperately trying to communicate, trying to drop hints, and the operator, the person, behind the counter at the bank, either was choosing not to listen because they didn't want to have to respond, or they just weren't picking up on the signs. So that piece around education, I think, is just so vitally important, because it does start to challenge some of those biases that Bobby was talking about. That's so important. And also, you know, back to Joanne was saying around, you know, this, you know, banks do start if they've got, you know, 2 customers, you know, from a perspective of a duty of care to both. You know, and it's very, you know, important to kind of start challenging that slightly. You know, I remember one of the most significant things for me when we started this work, and we started by training the leadership team, actually, because again, if you're going to model all of this and you want your staff to do the same, you need to be demonstrating it at the very high level to be able to create those responses that Sarah talked about. You know, you need that high level buy-in. You quite often have to operate outside of policy. You have to do things differently. So unless you've got the leadership behind this, you know, it's not very effective, really. And I just remember a really high level senior official just saying, wow, I never used to believe it, but there's 2 sides to every story. And that was because an abuser had been, well, a survivor had been removed from a joint bank account without the abuser's permission. And they wrote a letter and complained to the bank, which had always been their worry. And they were always worried that they were going to complain because, you know, they'd been left liable for the account, the joint, you know, the debt attached to the joint bank account. They didn't mention that in the letter. They just said, how dare you take away my control? You know, there's sometimes very obvious responses, you know, which give things away, you know, not agreeing to things that would be good for you financially because you're seeking control. You know, there's lots of giveaways there. So, yeah, I think that would just be some of my sort of initial reflections, I would say.
Sarah or Bobby, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, maybe just I mean, 2 things from my side. So one of the tools that we are designing for the banks that we're working with, the first one will be a pulse survey. So very, very short way of the banks to start capturing just a high level pulse of their employees and how their employees, their perspectives on this. So I think that's going to be a really interesting way to just start to get some very light touch insights. We are also designing a much more deep employee survey that again has been requested by one of the banks we're working with that will go deeper. And in this case, the bank's rationale was all of our employees are also our customers. So if we start by understanding how our customers are experiencing this and their perceptions, that already begins to tell us a lot about what's happening with our customers. So I think those will be 2 tools that, you know, that eventually we will be able to make public once we've tested them and you know, kind of refined them. And then the other big piece on this is when we come to the end of this initial project, so sort of sometime towards the end of next calendar year in 2025, we will host a large public event where we hope to bring together regulators, because obviously the regulator also has a really key role to play here in starting to push banks not only to start to take action, but also to be reporting on certain things. And so we know, for example, there are certain metrics that they could be reporting around, you know, the blocking of transactions or the blocking of, you know, digital payments, comments and things like that. So I think we will have an opportunity, and certainly I think all of those on the call today will be you know, will play an important role to this in actually starting to get regulators to be pushing a bit more on this. You know, we've seen it from the UK, we've seen it from Australia, but really, you know, those are kind of almost the 2 only countries who've really been looking at this from a regulatory perspective.
Maybe I'll just add, you know, I think it'll be really interesting to see what those employee surveys say. You know, in the experience that we've had so far working, you know, there's actually been a lot of people developing different types of economic coercion scales and indices, you know, in the research community that we recently tried, you know, out in Honduras. And I've written about this quite a bit because there was quite a bit of learning, you know, that came out of that experience. And, you know, what I think is an important takeaway is that despite knowing that economic violence is quite high, the surveys themselves were not picking this up that well. When you're asking people like, you know, how often are you being excluded from financial decisions, et cetera. And so for me too, I think if we start looking at it from that research perspective, I think there's still quite a bit of work to do to ensure that the questions are contextually appropriate and sensitive enough for people to be able to respond to those. So that's just been my experience as well, you know, and so for me, I'm even questioning myself, you know, what work can we be doing and what sorts of questions can we ask, whether in focus group discussions or surveys in a safe way that can help you start understanding how to understand it. But I do think this whole point of those complaints mechanisms or the interactions that people have directly with frontline workers is probably going to pick it up more than, surveying people just to kind of get a sense of what's the incidence of the experience of financial abuse. But I think, still so much to learn, because there's some to build on, but I don't think it's there yet for it to be that useful, for at least from a financial abuse perspective.
Thanks so much. I think this was really rich. And again, as per the introduction, it's really just the idea is to get us started. And just to recap a bit, what I heard, from today is really this question that financial abuse of women and girls is mostly happens in the context of domestic violence, but it can be broader and extend and happen with other family members or people in the network. That there's this question in particular, I think, Sarah, you raised about doing no harm for financial service providers first, getting your house in order first before you start engaging in externally is a really important one. And then I think just this last point that Bobby, you were making on the need to get more data on this topic, but having places for people to, safe places for people to report cases of domestic financial abuse, having FSPs have the right mechanisms in place for people to be able to report these type of abuses. And then I think Nicola and Sarah, you were talking about the role that the policymakers can and should have on requiring some reporting around these issues. So I think these are really some very interesting areas for us to collectively start putting our minds together. I want to just say as a wrap up that this is the start of the discussion. Over the next 3 days until June 28th, we're having an online discussion on the Finequity D groups. Finequity D groups is a platform where we exchange, we have online conversations between community members on topics. And so we'll be launching this online discussion right after this webinar, and we'll be having the discussion over the next few days. If you're not already signed up, please participate. If you're having trouble, please ask Swati for help. But the idea is really to get perspectives from everyone on this topic. The last is I want to say that Finequity is going to be launching a working group on this topic, and Swati will be sending out more details on this. But the idea is to get together and start exploring the working definition and some of the things that we can work on together. So with that, thank you very much, Sarah, Bobby, Nicola, for being participants in this first webinar. It was really a pleasure to host you, and looking forward to collective progress on this issue. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Aud. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.